is a constitutional law attorney, former senior legal advisor and personal counsel to President Donald J. Trump. Jenna Ellis believes in the rule of law and the importance of integrity in our elections. And she's ready to tackle the big cultural and legal issues facing America. This is the Jenna Ellis Show. Here is your host, Jenna Ellis.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Jenna Ellis Show. I'm Jenna Ellis, and I'm so delighted today to have my good friend, Dr. J. Battacharya, on to talk about everything that is government, bureaucracy, petty tyranny related. And of course, this goes back into the history of the COVID pandemic, everything that the deep state and the COVID task force were doing at the time, how they were advising President Trump. Dr. Battacharya has a lot of insights that you are going to find really fascinating. And then the parallels about how the medical community now is being treated similarly to the legal profession, and how the preferred narrative from the Ministry of Truth sought to censor and destroy the livelihoods and credibility of doctors who were simply having other theories and other options during COVID that were not preferred. And so there was a huge threat from the government against the medical community. And now we're seeing that as well with this Georgia indictment against the profession of law. So how do we meet these challenges? How do we move forward at this time in our country? Where you're going to find from Dr. Battacharya is so incredible about his insights going back through 2020, what he observed personally in his conversation with President Trump in August of 2020 in the Oval Office, what the lessons learned have been from that, and now how we as a country must move forward to make sure that government is not infringing on our rights and is not going to start criminalizing the practice of law or censoring the practice of medical science and all of these other theories that maybe aren't preferred by the government. But we have to make sure to limit the powers of government and make sure that their only legitimate power is to preserve and protect the rights that we all have that are specifically enumerated in the First Amendment. So this is going to be a fascinating episode. Stay tuned right after this. With inflation, the banking world collapse, and everything that Joe Biden is doing not to protect America, you need to make sure to secure your financial health, especially in retirement. And hey, if you're a millennial like me, that actually is sooner than you think. You need to start now, even if you are a millennial or a Gen Zer, to make sure that your financial health is actually healthy when we get to retirement. And Legacy Precious Metals has a revolutionary new online platform that allows you to invest in gold and silver online in real time. In a few easy steps, you can open an account online, select your metals of choice, and choose to have them stored in a vault or shipped right to your door. You'll have access to a dashboard where you can track your portfolio growth in real time anytime. You'll see transparent pricing on each coin and bar, and this puts you in complete control of your money. The platform is free to sign up for. Visit legacypminvestments.com and open your account and see this new investing platform for yourself. Gold hedges against inflation and against a volatile stock market. A truly diversified portfolio isn't just more stocks and bonds, but different asset classes. This brand new platform allows you to make investments in gold and silver, no matter how small or large, with just a few clicks. Visit legacypm.com to get started. You can download the free investor's guide, and you can also call Legacy PM Investments to talk to a portfolio expert to get expert answers to your to customize your personal portfolio. So visit legacypminvestments.com to get started. Tell them that Jenna sent you. So joining me now is my good friend, Jay Battacharya. And Jay, you are a health expert and a doctor, and you have gotten involved, I think, prolifically throughout this entire COVID pandemic narrative. You were one of the ones that stood up for freedom and liberty against the government's narrative. And so I'm really grateful to have this conversation with you because I want to kind of go back, first of all, and give people your background and why you got involved in all of this to begin with.
Thanks for having me on the show, Jen. I'm really honored to talk with you. So I'm a professor in the School of Medicine at Stanford for almost 2 decades. I've been a professor here, or more than 2 decades actually now. And I have focused my research on infectious disease policy, on health policy more generally, and on specifically like what happens with health policy that can really harm the poor, the vulnerable, for kids. So when COVID hit, it was like pretty squarely within my orbit of what I've been studying my entire life, researching, publishing on in peer-reviewed journals. And when I heard first about the lockdowns, I knew with certainty that it was going to end up causing tremendous economic damage, but not just economic damage. It's the consequence of the economic damage and who would hit that I knew was going to be really bad. I knew that it was going to you shut the world down. You hear about supply chains. I knew what it was going to do is it was going to put very, very poor people in poor countries into worse poverty. And that happened. The World Bank estimated 100 million people were thrown into $2 a day or less of income just in 2020. I knew it was going to put people at the brink of starvation. And that happened. 130 million people, according to the World Food Program in April of 2020, thrown into dire food insecurity. I knew that those were going to be the consequences. Also, I've been studying infectious disease policy for a long time and epidemiology for a long time. And so I also knew that the estimates that the government was putting out and the World Health Organization was putting out about the government, meaning like the CDC, about the death rate from COVID had to be an overestimate, right? The case fatality rate, if you remember back then, was like 3.4% was what the government was saying, what the World Health Organization was saying. But that only counted people who'd shown up at the hospital or come to the attention of doctors. Early in the pandemic, you don't get very much testing. You're just mainly going to see the most severe cases. And yeah, among the most severe cases, 3% die. But I knew that there had to have been many more people that had COVID and recovered that never came to the attention of doctors early in the pandemic. So those were the two major thoughts I had, main thoughts I had in like February, March 2020. As we approach the lockdowns.
Yeah, and I think from looking back now about 3 years ago, there has even in that short amount of time been a little bit of rewriting of history on both sides. Some people who, for political purposes, for other reasons, will try to say, oh, this was handled not the way that it actually was. And so let's go back though and talk about the truth of that, because I remember when I was working for President Trump at the time as the legal advisor of the campaign, personal counsel to him. And this was right after the acquittal of his first impeachment. And then just a couple weeks later, suddenly we're hearing about this potential virus that has the possibility of being a pandemic. And I remember talking to a friend of mine who was a reporter who was very concerned about the government instituting lockdowns. And from a constitutional perspective, I thought, there is absolutely no way that is ever going to happen. And how could the government possibly think that they had the power and the authority to even contemplate doing that? There's no way. And then suddenly we get to the 15 days to slow the spread, people voluntarily going, but how in your view, what did you know at the time? And then what did you see as the government and what ultimately became the COVID task force, their response that concerned you?
Right. So if you go back to February, it actually looked like to me that the president was getting pretty good advice, even from people like Tony Fauci back then. Like that, what he was in one sense, he was getting advice from so many people inside the government, health experts inside the government that say, well, don't lock down. We handle these things by not panicking the population. We handle these things by protecting vulnerable people. And I still remember. President Trump got a lot of grief because of the shutting down of the travel from China. I think that was like late February 2020. I was actually against that. I should say, Jenna, because I knew it seemed to me like the virus was already here. What's the Chinese lockdown going to do? What's that going to do? I looked with horror at what was happening in China in January 2020. But at the same time, he seemed to have both the advice and his like public pronouncements, although they were met up normally typically with like people he has a very interesting effect on people, as I'm sure you know, Jen. Anyways, he the like as far as like actually what was done, it was more consistent in February 2020 with what we had done for a century of respiratory virus pandemics. Like, you protect vulnerable people, you find out who's vulnerable, you protect them, you don't panic the population, you try to calm the population down. People are prone to be panicked when there's a new virus afloat. And so the role of public health is to provide calm, to provide resources to vulnerable people. That's what I thought we were going to be doing in February 2020. I was absolutely stunned, not for constitutional reasons, but for epidemiological reasons and public health reasons, when the lockdown arrived in March, mid-March. It struck me as there was not a sufficient basis in the empirical and scientific data to warrant a lockdown, and that insufficient attention had been paid to the consequences of it. I'm never going to forget that press conference where it's President Trump and Tony Fauci, and I think Deborah Birx and Jerome Adams and others, where he's announcing the lockdown, 2 weeks. I knew it wasn't going to be 2 weeks. Like, once you have instituted a lockdown, you cause panic in the population. And once that panic sets in, it's very hard to get out of it, as we've seen. I don't think there's still like many people still in it 3.5 years on. So it shocked me to see President Trump up there essentially ceding the presidency to Tony Fauci in mid-March 2020.
Wow. And why do you think that was the response at the time? I mean, was this something that, there have been suggestions that the government knew, and the deep state through Tony Fauci and others, that they knew that this was going to be a pretext to attempt to weaponize government and to usher in this new precedent of emergency authority. Was that what ultimately you saw as a motivation, or what was the contemplation at the time that you knew of or that you suspected?
Well, back then in March of 2020, I'd never written an op-ed before mid-March 2020. I just published scientific papers. I didn't know anything about politics. I'd never been on media before. So back then, I was really just puzzled. I thought, okay, they're not seeing the scientific data about the age stratified risk. They're not thinking through the costs and harms of they're overestimating the ability of these lockdowns to actually work, especially since, I view them as trickle-down epidemiology. Huge numbers of people, especially poor people, can't possibly comply. They don't have the economic circumstances where they can. And so essentially you're saying, you guys take the burden of the disease while the laptop class gets to stay home. I mean, it struck me as like a scientific matter. I just needed to make these scientific points, and then people will change their minds. I look back on that and I'm like, I still think it was important to make the scientific points, but it strikes me as naive. So going back, I've read a bunch of documents about what was happening inside the government, inside the NIH and other places within the government then. So I think a couple of things I've arrived on as likely reasons. First is the example of China in January 2020 had a tremendous impact on the minds of a lot of people inside public health in the United States. There are emails, FOIA emails from January, February 2020, where Tony Fauci is trying to get his deputy, Cliff Lane, to go on this junket that the World Health Organization was organizing to China to assess the effectiveness of its January 2020 lockdown. They came back from that junket. Cliff Lane came back from that junket and helped write a report for the World Health Organization that essentially said that what the Chinese did had worked. They had rid the world, their country, of COVID. And he wrote this email to the right around as he comes back to this epidemiologist of the World Health Organization, saying what China did worked, albeit at great costs. The Congress, he writes, essentially, like, what we should do next is going to require more than just the people in this room to decide. I wonder if President Trump ever heard about that. So it's I think that World Health Organization report and the example of China played a big role in the switch. The second thing that I think played a big role is that a lot of the people that were in charge of the COVID response on the public health side were people that were very prominent in the HIV pandemic. And so this is like a more innocent mistake. This is like a intellectual mistake. The kinds of strategies that you use to manage HIV successfully, contact tracing, those kinds of strategies assume, it's HIV. There's no immunity after you get HIV. In fact, it kills your immune system, right? There's all of AIDS is long HIV. All these assumptions that are true for HIV, held by the leaders of our pandemic response, they carried them over and pretended as if COVID would have the same features. That it wasn't like, so I remember like early in the pandemic, you weren't allowed to say that you were immune after you got COVID. I mean, they pretended like there was no immunity. Why would they do that for a coronavirus? It made no sense unless you are conditioned by your like intellectual environment being HIV your entire career to think, oh, most viruses don't produce immunity. It just didn't make sense. But it would make sense if those leaders don't have the intellectual agility to say, well, COVID is very different than HIV. They designed their response in many ways. The lockdowns, except for the lockdowns, all the other elements of the response are like things that we did for HIV.
That is fascinating because COVID clearly was not analogous to HIV. And I'm not a doctor, but just what I know, and I mean, and I've had COVID a couple times and I've gotten over it, and that's and the severity for me in my health condition, as a young female with no underlying health conditions, was fine. And so, and I got over it fine. So why was the response to this particular virus at this particular time? Because a lot of people saw this and the response as very political, but it wasn't just the United States. I mean, it looked like the world responded with almost bioweapon protocols to this particular virus when, we see all kinds of iterations of other viruses that come and go without this type of panic.
Yeah. So that I think what you just said is very, very important, Jenna. So like if you think about this, first, the lockdowns were a global phenomenon. Wasn't just the United States. The World Health Organization played a tremendously important role. Tony Fauci played a tremendously important role in the United States, of course, but also worldwide. Like people around the world listened to him. The point you make about bioweapons, I don't know if there's bioweapon, but you said bioweapon protocol. And I think that's very, very important. There were protocols to lock down in the context of a bioterror attack. Which this wasn't. At least it didn't. As far as I know, it wasn't. So let me just tell a theory. This is a theory. I don't know. This is not. Everyone that's listening, this is my hypothesis. And I'm telling a story. I'm happy to revise it if I get more data. But here's a story. Imagine you're Tony Fauci. You have been a proponent of pandemic preparedness for 2 decades. The pandemic preparedness, basically, you pushed have been involved going into the bat caves of China and all the other wild places of the world, drawing viruses out of the wildlife there, bringing them into labs to do experiments on those viruses. The reason to do those experiments is because you want to predict which virus, if it mutates enough, it will start to infect humans. Right now, this virus just infects bats. How many mutations does it need to infect humans? What does it need to infect humans? And you essentially are supportive of a research program dating back to the early aughts. In 2012, there was a success in this research program. In 2012, there was a paper published from a group out in the Netherlands that had found a way to take avian flu and turn it into something that could very efficiently infect humans using this gain-of-function methods. It led to a tremendous outcry in the scientific community that led President Obama to issue a pause in this work. In 2017, that pause was undone. Right as the Trump administration is coming in, with Tony Fauci taking the lead administratively, trying to figure out a way to undo the pause because he thinks this work is important. The argument, just to make to give the devil his due, the argument for this is that you have to, if you can predict which viruses are going to make the leap, you can prepare beforehand with vaccines and treatments for that specific virus, so that when it enters human populations, you are ready. You can protect human life automatically.
So let's talk then about the so-called vaccine, because this was another thing. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Jenna. Let me just finish the story because this is really important. I'll talk about that because it's really this links into the vaccine. Um, the problem with this, the reason why the scientific community wanted to stop this is because there's lots of lab leaks that happen all the time, even in high security labs. And these are dangerous viruses, as we found out. And so put yourself in Tony Fauci's shoes. It's late 2019. You've spent your entire career trying to get an HIV vaccine that's failed. You've done this pandemic preparedness business, and now you're saying you're going to prepare the world against another pandemic. But now there's like people saying that this virus that's floating around was caused by the work that you supported, that the scientific community had said what might be too dangerous to do. And you see in January 2020 that the Chinese have like figured out a way to solve this problem, just locked down. It's like I call this the Pandora's box theory. You've opened Tony Fauci, you've opened Pandora's box. The virus has gone out. You're going to do everything you can to like close it. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of psychology explains in part the response to the lockdowns and so on. The vaccines enter in this because it's interesting, Jenna. The vaccine target for this virus comes out in January 2020, days after the sequencing of the virus, the public sequencing, the sequence of the virus is publicly released. You have like pharmaceutical companies already knowing exactly the vaccine target. When I first heard about this disease, I thought it would take a decade to get a vaccine or longer. That's normally how long it takes to get to test and test a vaccine and make sure it works at scale. I was stunned when I heard about Operation Warp Speed. I say pleasantly stunned, because I think the idea that you could get a vaccine quickly, put yourself in the shoes of March of 2020 it was like a huge positive thing. Like here's a disease that really does hurt older people. And so I thought it was a really good idea. What I didn't understand was how the vaccine would end up being used and the social consequences of the vaccine. That I didn't really appreciate until like December 2020.
And I appreciate you saying that too, because I think for a lot of us initially, I was one that stayed home and complied with the 15 days to slow the spread, because I thought, okay, these are the experts and we're going to go with their advice and those protocols. And I certainly don't in any way say or criticize President Trump for going along with that advice, because I think all of us, even, especially those of us who aren't in this field, are having to rely on experts. But you mentioned, of course, earlier that, President Trump ended up basically deferring or ceding the last year of his presidency. And I think that's true. And as we learned more, even, leading up to Easter in 2020, when we're seeing some of these social effects, like the lockdowns of churches, and when you have, big box stores and strip clubs and marijuana dispensaries that are open, but then like my client, Pastor John MacArthur, and you and I were both in the movie, The Essential Church, talking about all of this, and I'd encourage everyone to go see it. But as we're seeing some of this disparity, and we're also seeing that the data just doesn't back up what they're telling us, what point was it where you thought, okay, wait a minute, this isn't what they're telling us, and the social consequences, the economic consequences, this is the moment where we need to stand up and say, wait a minute, and where would you have liked to see President Trump step in on behalf of America and the administration to basically say no?
I was opposed to lockdown from March 2020 on. I thought it was a terrible mistake. But I could understand, why so many of my colleagues and others were saying this. Like this obviously is a terrible virus, and they wanted time. So I think it was. I was opposed to it, but I think it was defensible in March of 2020. I still think it was a mistake. I'm going to go to my grave thinking it was a mistake, Jenna. But I can understand it. What happened though is that. I think, like, looking back at that March, April, May period, I think there were governors and President Trump himself that had second thoughts, right? So, I've spoken, for instance, with Governor DeSantis about this period, and he apologized for the lockdown in March of 2020. What happened there was like Trump and Pence allowed Deborah Birx, who was the head of the COVID task force, to go fly around the country, scaring the living daylights out of every single governor, telling them it's irresponsible to keep your state open. And of course, most politicians complied because, they're not experts. They essentially, what happened was like a small group of experts hijacked the sort of like administrative sort of procedures to try to inform the president and the government with one view, when there should have been multiple views, right? Because there was a lot of objection in the scientific community to this, but you wouldn't know it if you were paying attention to the press, and you wouldn't. And I think if you were inside the government, it would have been difficult for you to know it also, because Tony Fauci and his cohort organized it so that it was very difficult for anyone, for governors and so on, to even realize there were alternate views out there. Right. Mm-hmm. They were the only view. Tony Fauci goes around saying I'm science itself. I mean, what are you going to do, right? If you're helpless, if most governors, and you're helpless if you're President Trump. President Trump then in July of 2020 hires my friend Scott Atlas, and I was thrilled because Scott and I had been talking basically every day for months. From April 2020 on, I'd run this study on seroprevalence. That is, how many people had COVID antibodies in April of 2020 in California, Northern California and Southern California, and we found like 3 or 4% of people already had COVID. It was already too late. The lockdowns weren't going to stop the disease. So we had the scientific backing for understanding the lockdowns weren't going to work. We had the tremendous evidence saying that lockdowns are going to be damaging to children, to poor people. And so, I think I gave a interview in early April 2020 to Fox, Steve Hilton's show, saying we shouldn't be locking down, we should be protecting vulnerable older people. So I was really happy when President Trump selected Scott Atlas, because he understood very deeply. He's the former chair of neuroradiology at Stanford, a fantastic health policy advisor. So he understood very deeply the folly of the lockdowns and the harms of the lockdowns. And I think that's what he was telling President Trump. But then as the summer wore on, I just grew more and more frustrated because Scott would call me every day saying, look, no one's listening to me inside here. I'm presenting data and papers, and it's just like talking to a brick wall. They're not interested. He tried to organize a visit up to the White House, and he was getting blocked by folks inside the White House, turns out by Deborah Birx herself. I kept asking myself, if the president of the United States is the president of the United States, he's decided that the strategy he used in this pandemic was wrong to begin with, and he switched. That's what hiring Scott Atlas means, right? Why is he keeping the old people around? It's like you're conducting a war, it's failing, and you decide to change strategies, but you keep the old generals around to undermine the new general you've hired. That's what happened during that summer. At least that was my view of what happened during that summer of 2020. That President Trump, and I actually did finally get to visit with President Trump in August of 2020 in the Oval Office. It was really difficult for Scott to arrange this, but I visited with Martin Kulldorff, Joe Latipo, the now Surgeon General of Florida. We sat and talked with him for President Trump in the Oval Office for an hour. It was a remarkable kind of exchange. My main goal was to tell President Trump that it was very, very important to open schools, that children were going to get hurt in the fall if you kept schools closed, and that the Swedish and Icelandic experience Swedish experience especially was that keeping schools open for children was relatively safe, certainly much safer than closing them, which hurt children, still are hurting children. And I told him that ideas for better protection of older people, because that was the most important thing as far as COVID is concerned. Those were my two messages. He listened to us for an hour. Frankly, I thought I viewed him as curious. He's not as, he hadn't read the literature like, for instance, Governor DeSantis had when I spoke with him. I was sort of intellectually more impressed with Governor DeSantis, but I could tell that President Trump was deeply uncomfortable with the lockdowns. He asked me in the Oval Office, he said he closed the country down. He said that he did it because 2 million people would die if he didn't do it. The reason he said that is because that's that Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx had told him. they were basing it on a model that actually put out by this this group in London, the Imperial College London group, that forecasted that if Trump didn't lock the country down, 2 million people would die within 2 months. That model was false. Like, if you apply the model to Sweden, it predicted that 100,000 people would die in Sweden within 2 months. That's, Sweden has a smaller population, right? So 100,000 people, 2,000, 3,000 people died in that from that first wave in COVID in Sweden, not 100,000. The model was off by orders of magnitude. So President Trump was being fed information by scientists who were insufficiently skeptical about the data that they were looking at, and used their power to make sure that the president didn't see alternate viewpoints.
So what was President Trump's response then to you? Because obviously you are presenting to him directly an alternate point of view, and something that in my view, from a political perspective, would have made him a lot more popular with conservatives, with his base. People were telling him openly to reopen. People at this juncture in August of 2020 were not buying the narrative. We're seeing, the BLM riots, and how the leftist governors are saying it's fine if you have a certain political persuasion to be out in giant populations, but if you're Christians or you're conservatives, then you need to lock down still. So we're seeing the absolute hypocrisy of this. And I think that is where the skepticism was born, as well as people like yourself and others who had alternative viewpoints and other therapeutics that were being censored on social media that didn't go along with Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx's narrative. So what was President Trump's response? Because, clearly he's seeing now these two perspectives.
I mean, so when I told him that 2 million, he didn't save 2 million. I mean, he just looked sad. I mean, I think he genuinely thought he was saving a lot of lives by that lockdown. And but he linked it to his re-election prospects. This was, obviously re-election was near the top of his mind, I think, in August of 2020. But I have to say, well, let me just say what he said. He thought that he thought that well, he didn't say this, but others in the White House told me this. If he fires Fauci and Birx in August of 2020, he was not going to get reelected. That's what he thought.
Wow. And
I mean, like, politically, it would have been difficult, I imagine. I mean, I don't know. I know nothing about politics, but like, I can understand. Like, there was a lot of hero worship of Fauci at the time. And so if you had President Trump firing Tony Fauci, now he's now saying he didn't have the power to fire Fauci. And that, I guess is technically true, but he could have demoted him from the task force, not had him on the COVID task force that was making decisions about COVID policy. He would have sent him back to the NIAID and not had him elevated as essentially the chief spokesperson of the COVID response. He could have told Debbie Birx to go back to her old job, not as part of the head of the COVID task force. He could have done all those things, but he didn't do those things. And I think he didn't do those things because he was afraid that he would lose the re-election if he did those things. I agree with you, though. I think, well, let me just put it this way. Like, I don't know the political consequences. I mean, I don't know what, maybe that's right. He's obviously a better politician than I will ever imagine to be. I'm never going to, so I don't know, but at some fundamental level, I don't actually care. You're the president of the United States. You think that the right strategy for the public at large for this pandemic is focused protection, more closer to what Scott Atlas is advocating. You do that even if you're going to lose the election, right? That is your job as president of the United States. You don't let those electoral considerations enter the most important decision you're going to make as president. It's a hugely consequential decision for the health and well-being of literally billions of people. And I think, I mean, I don't know what to say about that. I think it's just a tragedy. If he had followed his instincts, even that's what led him to hire Scott Atlas, the whole world would have been better off. Would he have still lost the election? Maybe, I don't know, but I don't think that's as important as the decision to continue the lockdown.
Yeah, really well said. And I think, anyone who is elected to office, or if you are a general of a military, or you are, in any position of leadership, and especially when you have the decision-making capacity for people's freedoms and liberties and precedent. The same thing as the United States Supreme Court. I mean, they are supposed to be apolitical and not influenced by the court of public opinion or by their polls or their likability and favorability rates, because they hold so much power over how we as Americans can conduct our daily lives and can exercise our freedoms. And so what was, to your knowledge, what was Scott Atlas's response at the time? And did he encourage President Trump to sideline Fauci and Birx and say, listen, the data bears out this way, and we need to take a different path?
Yeah, that was Scott's advice. Like, he was telling the president, keep schools open, protect older people better in nursing homes and other places, but don't lock down. The lockdowns and the panic mongering are just causing more harm than good. Stop testing people that have no symptoms in a futile bid to stop the disease from spreading. We just don't have the capacity. We don't have the technology to stop the disease from spreading. Why are we trying to stop the tide from coming in? Instead, why don't we protect the people who are living in low-lying areas from the tide coming in? Move them to higher ground. I think that kind of idea, let's do what we can do. Let's not pretend to do what we can't do, because that's causing so much harm. That's essentially what Scott was telling. He would call me every day from the White House, just telling me how frustrated he was, how he couldn't get his message through to Tony Fauci, to Deborah Birx, the task force generally, and how it was just met with a brick wall. And I think, I look back on that time, and it's just tragic. It is absolutely tragic. It's not that the information wasn't there; it's that the balance of power inside the sort of the NIH, the CDC, and the White House itself was such that this view of let's protect the vulnerable, let's not panic the rest of the population, that view had no chance of winning the day. And President Trump, who was probably the one person who could have forced it, because he is the president, just didn't have I think he wanted to. I think he had the sense that it was the right thing to do, but just didn't have the moral courage to say, even if I lose the election, I'm going to do this.
And that is the obligation of anyone in elected office, to do the right thing regardless of the consequences. And unfortunately, look at the consequences anyway. And so if you, from a moral perspective, you do the right thing anyway, and the consequences can bear themselves out. But if you have the moral courage to stand up for what's right and you suffer those consequences, better that than not standing for what's right and then you suffer the bad consequences anyway. I wonder if there is any regret on his part. And it's very fascinating to me to see this now 3 years later, where unlike Governor DeSantis, and others who have said, the lockdowns will never happen. We're passing legislation to make sure that this is never weaponized again in terms of government overriding liberties and freedoms. You don't see that same type of humility and apology from President Trump. And I think that that's also fascinating, because we are leading up into another election. But let's also talk about what the censorship was from the government, from the leftist media, Twitter that was run at that time, not by Elon Musk. And for all of us who just wanted information, this was really where the whole disinformation and misinformation and fact checking and all this stuff kind of began to bubble up, because viewpoints like yours and Dr. Atlas's were sequestered and censored, and you couldn't get an alternative viewpoint. And so there were a lot of other people that seemed to be colluding. And in fact, we know now the Biden administration was colluding with big tech to censor and suppress certain non-preferred narratives. But what does that tell you about the larger picture of all this and where we go from here, that this doesn't happen again?
It was shocking to watch as an American to see essentially what's happened during the pandemic, and maybe most Americans don't know this, but it's a fact. The government used its power to control the conversation by censoring legally protected, First Amendment protected speech in social media and other settings. It used its power to smear and destroy critics, outside critics of government policies, essentially violating the First Amendment rights of a tremendous number of people. So let me just build up to that. I should now that I've given you the conclusion for why I think this. And I think first, I think this whole censorship industrial complex, I mean, I call it the Ministry of Truth, actually had its roots even earlier than the Biden administration. I think during the Trump administration, there was the beginnings of it. You could kind of see this in the way that the New York Post story about the Hunter Biden laptop was treated, right? 50 intelligence gurus in the government sign a letter saying it's Russian disinformation, even though it's obviously not, and everyone silences anyone who like shares it, censors it. There's this around elections. There's this like, you're not allowed to say, I think that the election has some problems, right? Although, you know, I don't know if it does or doesn't, but like, you're not allowed to say it. That censorship industrial complex got applied at scale to the COVID discussion. And I'm a plaintiff in a case called the Missouri versus Biden case, brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's offices. I'm represented by the New Civil Liberties Alliance. Me, Martin Kulldorff, Aaron Cariotti was a UC Irvine professor, and Jill Hines. We're plaintiffs in this case against the Biden administration. In this case, we got to discovery. So we got to depose Tony Fauci. We got to depose representatives from the Surgeon General's office, the CDC, and the White House itself. Jen Psaki's representative from the communications. The picture we found is of a vast effort where government officials would directly threaten the financial viability of social media companies unless they censored particular people and ideas that the White House did not want on social media. When I joined Twitter in 2021, I was put on a blacklist. And I got to go to Twitter and I see the database. It said the word blacklist next to my face and name. You know, I thought blacklists were a thing of like the 1950s, not 2023. What you have is essentially a vast enterprise designed to destroy the First Amendment rights of the American population, that especially those who are effective at criticizing government policy. And the reason why, at least in the context of COVID, like you could see what they were doing. Like they would suppress even true things, like the idea, the fact that the COVID vaccine, which I think was actually important for older people to take because it reduced their likelihood of death. But then the COVID vaccine doesn't stop you from getting and spreading COVID. That was clear in, like, say, late spring, early summer 2021, and yet you weren't allowed to say that online. If you said that, you would get tagged by this censorship industrial complex as a misinformation spreader, and you'd be banned, blacklisted, or put on some like sort of low visibility threshold. Like you could share true facts, but you share that fact, that means that the government's COVID mandates, vaccine mandates, don't make any sense. If my vaccine just protects me and not you, well, why do you care if I'm vaccinated? Why do I have to be mandated to take it? Why do you have to be mandated to take it? What they wanted to do with the censorship was to create this illusion of consensus around the ideas that they were basing their policies on. But there was no consensus, and they contradicted the scientific fact. There was a funny thing, like at one point, the CDC issued a warning about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I don't know if you remember, from April of 2021.
I remember that, yeah.
They paused it. They called it a pause because they found an elevated risk of strokes in young and middle-aged women and older women. So they paused the vaccine for a week, and the White House shared this fact on its Facebook page. If you look at the emails around the time before that, the White House was haranguing Facebook, saying, "You have to get all this anti-vax content off. You're killing people. If you don't do this, we're going to destroy your company." Effectively, right? We're going to regulate you out of existence. And Facebook complied. They put in all these policies as AI policies to screen for anti-vax content, suppress it. Even true vaccine injury groups were were suppressed. The White House puts out this CDC determination about the J&J vaccine, and there's the AI algorithms tag the White House as Facebook page as an anti-vax site, and so so you have these emails of the White House, Rob Flaherty, screaming at Facebook, essentially saying, "What's wrong with you guys? Why are you calling us anti-vax?" And the White House had just shared the true fact, which is the CDC had paused the J&J vaccine, and that they themselves got ensnared by their own censorship complex. So you just have this monster that the White House, that the Biden administration has used to senselessly censor. Can I use those words next to each other? Against a vast amounts of even true speech, destroying essentially the credibility of public health, enabling very, very destructive policies to continue far longer than they would have had there been an adequate, an appropriate venue for pushback against it.
And, all of this reminds me of what they're doing now, the broader industrial complex, if you will, of the deep state that are now targeting my profession in lawyering. Because in the medical profession, if you didn't go with the government's preferred COVID narrative, if you wanted to have free and fair debate, if you wanted to exercise your constitutionally protected First Amendment liberties, then you're censored. They're actually targeting these companies to destroy their livelihood and threatening them. And that destroys the medical profession. I mean, this discussion and debate about what the better protocols are, about these discussions about how we should move forward, what actually is legal and constitutional, what is the best policy. All of these things should be freely debated, and people who are watching this, who have to make the best decisions for themselves and their families with respect to the vaccine, that should never be compelled for anyone, but should be an analysis and an individual understanding of what do I believe is the best for myself and my family, and then I'll either take it or not. I was always an advocate to say, if there's a resource out there, fine. That's good. And like you said, if it helps the older population or those who are more at risk, great. But for people, like me, I never felt that I was hugely at risk, and I had COVID early on and recovered very easily. So I never wanted to take the vaccine or to have the government tell me that I had to, especially when there were other risk factors and dangers. But what the government is doing in terms of this broader ministry of truth, like what you're saying, to destroy science and the profession and the intellectual argumentation, they're doing the exact same thing now in the midst of election challenges and lawyering and having theories about the Constitution and arguments and debate with how they're targeting also the lawyers like me and like others that are basically being censored from talking about the Constitution, the Electoral College Act, all of these things about how do we get to election integrity. I mean, these were the two main topics in 2020, the COVID narrative and election integrity, that were totally basically banned all across social media, across legacy media, if you didn't go along with the government's preferred narrative. So I think this is even a bigger threat than just what people see as, oh, this is targeting President Trump or, political. This is a greater threat more broadly to our fundamental freedoms and liberties.
I mean, there's an irony here, right? So you have a very powerful group of political types saying that we have to censor speech, we have to smear and defame people who criticize government policy because it's dangerous to democracy. Like I've seen what you've gone through, Jenna. And my heart goes out to you. I can't imagine the kind of pressure you must be under. But you were just being a lawyer. I mean, you're trying to advocate for your client. And then all of a sudden you criminalize that. Essentially, it's like an act of saying that what you're doing by lawyering is so dangerous you shouldn't be allowed to do it. The same, a similar analogous thing happened with critics of COVID policy. Like the censorship. What's interesting about censorship is it's not. This is the information age. You can't actually stop people from hearing me, right? That's not the actual purpose of censorship. It's to reduce the number of people who hear me. That's possible. But then second, and more important, the very fact that the government censors me, puts me on a blacklist, socially, what it does is it undermines me in the eyes of the public. It's essentially laundering a disinformation via this censorship act with an argument that if I'm allowed to talk, dangerous public health policies will be put into place. The Great Barrington Declaration. If you're allowed to lawyer, you're going to undermine democracy. But the irony is that they're using tactics. This essentially the censorship industrial complex, the criminalization of the practice of law, that themselves are undermining the roots of democracy. How do you have a democracy without free speech? How do you have a democracy without free speech rights? Those are absolutely bedrock fundamental, the lowest level fundamental. If you get rid of that, you don't actually have a democracy. You don't actually have science. You just have a high clerisy declaring that I am the science and saying you have to do this, and if you disagree with me, we're going to take you down. We'll do a devastating takedown of you. That is just raw power, not democracy. So I think in the United States at this point I think we are at a very, very dangerous moment in time. You have essentially the commanding heights of power using its muscle to in ways that undermine our capacity to have a democracy at all, a republic at all. I hope that we can reverse that, but it's a dangerous moment for science. It's a dangerous moment for policy, and it's a dangerous moment in our political environment. I have to say, Jen, I'm an immigrant to this country, and I have seen it recover over and over again from its threats. I still hold out high hopes that our institutions are strong enough to survive this, but we are, I think, at a very low moment in American history at the moment.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more that I hope that our system, as it's designed to legitimize the powers of government when they are exercised to preserve and protect the freedom and liberty and rights of the people, can still prevail. And that our system, with all of the different safeguards and the separation of powers, will still prevail. We have gone through a lot in America's history, but there is this giant threat to our freedoms and liberties. And if you are now criminalizing and censoring and trying to destroy the livelihoods and credibilities of political opposition or against discussion and debate and theories and challenges that are not preferred by the regime, that is not America. That is not the constitutionally protected rights that we know in the First Amendment require us to have free and fair debate and to have the ability as we, the people, to come together and to determine our best path forward. And one of the things that I think is so critical right now are people who will over politicize this and say, well, I'm only, for you if I agree with what you say, or I'm only for you if I like that you represented Donald Trump, for example, or, this has nothing to do with loving or hating Donald Trump. We can have the political analysis. We can all exercise our vote in the best way possible. I think this is a broader principle than that. And it is also more fundamental that the right to disagree and the right to publicly debate, the right to petition the government for redress, the right to exercise freedom of speech, in the case of John MacArthur and the other clients, the right to freely exercise religion and have our faith principles and not have the government come in and tell churches what they can and can't do in terms of worship and how they practice their faith. These are all threats fundamentally to our liberty and freedom. And so from the perspective of the medical community, have you seen generally people in your profession understand this and want to address this type of threat differently? Or are we still at a moment where we are facing the challenge that people just don't even understand what's going on?
Well, the problem inside medicine and public health is that the people that made the decisions to lock down, to recommend lockdown, they're still very much in power. There was just recently, for instance, a publication, a peer-reviewed publication in the Journal of American Medical Association, the top American medical journal other than New England Journal, that listed 52 doctors who were spreading misinformation. And the kind of misinformation online, the kind of misinformation that they identified was things like, if you've had COVID and recovered, you actually have some protection, some immunity. if you take the vaccine, you can still get COVID. Those true facts were deemed as misinformation. People essentially smeared in the pages of a top medical journal. People like Tony Fauci are getting, research jobs in or top like high jobs in places like Georgetown. You're getting essentially like an elevation of the failed leaders inside medicine. They're giving themselves awards, and you're having like whitewashes done by various organizations to try to pretend like the lockdowns worked when they obviously didn't. Sweden has lower all-cause excess deaths than basically almost every other country in Europe. That California has higher all-cause excess deaths through the pandemic than Florida did. Florida followed. The children went to school in Florida in person in fall of 2020. That wasn't true. My kids were not allowed to go foot inside of a classroom for a year and a half in California. What you have is like a disconnect between where the facts are and where the sort of the powers that be within medicine are. It's too embarrassing. Like these people sort of took on themselves this mantle, this sort of like coat of expertise that was so authoritative that they could essentially smear and destroy people who disagreed with them, and they turned out to be wrong, deeply wrong. And so, like, what do you do with that case? What they're doing is they're doubling down. They're trying to pretend as if that their policies worked. When it's clear to the vast chunk of a huge chunk of the American public that they obviously didn't. And I think that's true for both Republicans and Democrats. I think Republicans almost uniformly don't think that the policies worked, and a lot of Democrats agree with that. The Democrats' children suffered too during the pandemic. Everyone's kids did. Poor people of all stripes. It doesn't matter what your politics. To me, it's never been a political issue. This has been an issue about what the right public health strategy ought to be. And to see this medical sort of establishment sort of close ranks around itself to pretend like it did right when it didn't is just very disheartening, especially since I've been part of that establishment for decades.
Yeah, I feel the exact same way about my profession and the practice of law, that they're sort of closing ranks around whether the issue that you're representing or the client is preferred politically. Lawyering should not be about politics at all. It should be about the rule of law, the practice of law. And it doesn't matter if your name is Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or Hunter Biden or, anybody else who anybody's never even heard of. Everyone has the right to counsel, the right to petition the government for redress. And the fact that we are so politicizing these professions and we are weaponizing government to say that you can only practice them under certain conditions and in a preferred government narrative is really dangerous to freedom and liberty. And we're almost out of time, Jay, and I so appreciate all of your insights and your willingness to simply stand up with courage and speak truth. The last question I know everyone will have is, are the lockdowns coming back? And with all of this chatter now about, wearing masks again and maybe having to wear masks on airplanes and all this stuff, people are tired of this. They don't want to comply with it. Where do you see us going from here? And what is the best way for the average person to sort of stand up and say, I disagree with this?
I would have thought a month ago, if you asked me, there's no chance of them coming back. But schools have closed again. Like I just saw a report out of Kentucky and Texas where school districts are closing because they tested a bunch of people and they found some COVID. You can't close schools anymore. We've done enough harm to our children. Mask mandates, I think most places we won't have them, but if you live in a blue state or a blue city inside a red state, it might come back. I'm certainly seeing a lot of pressure for that to happen. And will lockdowns come back? That seems unlikely. The business closures, the church closures. At this point, the big difference between now and 2023, other than the fact that most of the population has had COVID and recovered, and therefore has a certain degree of immunity against severe disease and death if they get COVID again. The main difference now is that you have a population that's just, as you said, tired of it, that's seen the failure of it. I just saw Matt Hennessy wrote a nice piece in the Wall Street Journal saying that he won't comply with the orders this time. I think a lot of Americans feel that way. a lot, if you're being forced by somebody, some petty bureaucrat to like wear a mask in outdoors, people are going to say no. They're just going to say, I don't want that. I'm not going to do that. And they're just, you'll have a nation of scofflaws.
Yeah. And well, I'm really grateful that I live in the free state of Florida now. And I think that we won't have any of those mandates. And, if I have to refrain from flying for a little bit, I'll probably do that, because I don't want to have to ever wear a mask again. It was gross and ridiculous. But Jay, really appreciate it. How can people support you and also follow you and get your insights against all of the censorship? Because I really appreciate, again, that you just stand up with truth and courage to simply give your advice and opinions and theories without fear or favor. So thank you for your work.
Thank you, Jenna, for having me. So folks can follow me on Twitter. I'm on Dr. J Bhattacharya, the letter J, Battacharya, Battacharya. Every third letter's an A. Dr. J Bhattacharya on Twitter. And then I'm on, I have a new podcast I run called The Illusion of Consensus on Substack with this journalist, Rav Arora. So you can follow me there as well.
Oh, awesome. I didn't even know about your podcast. So thanks for letting me know. I'm definitely going to go over there and subscribe and listen to that. So thanks again, Jay. Really appreciate it. And I look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you, Jenna.
With inflation, the banking world collapse, and everything that Joe Biden is doing not to protect America, you need to make sure to secure your financial health, especially in retirement. And hey, if you're a millennial like me, that actually is sooner than you think. You need to start now, even if you are a millennial or a Gen Zer, to make sure that your financial health is actually healthy when we get to retirement. And Legacy Precious Metals has a revolutionary new online platform that allows you to invest in gold and silver online in real time. In a few easy steps, you can open an account online, select your metals of choice, and choose to have them stored in a vault or shipped right to your door. You'll have access to a dashboard where you can track your portfolio growth in real time anytime. You'll see transparent pricing on each coin and bar, and this puts you in complete control of your money. The platform is free to sign up for. Visit legacypminvestments.com and open your account and see this new investing platform for yourself. Gold hedges against inflation and against a volatile stock market. A truly diversified portfolio isn't just more stocks and bonds, but different asset classes. This brand new platform allows you to make investments in gold and silver, no matter how small or large, with just a few clicks. Visit legacypm.com to get started. You can download the free investor's guide, and you can also call Legacy PM Investments to talk to a portfolio expert to get expert answers to your to customize your personal portfolio. So visit legacypminvestments.com to get started. Tell them that Jenna sent you.
On MyPillow's 20-year anniversary, with over 80 million MyPillows sold, Mike Lindell wants to thank each and every one of you by giving you the lowest price in history on his MyPillows. You will receive a queen-size MyPillow for only $19.98. The regular price is $69.98 and just $10 more for a king size. You'll receive deep discounts on all MyPillow products such as bed sheets, mattress toppers, pet beds, mattresses, my slippers, which I love, and so much more. This is the time to try out some of the amazing products you've had your eye on from MyPillow. So go to mypillow.com and enter promo code Jenna to receive this amazing offer on the queen size MyPillow for $19.98. You can go to mypillow.com or call 1-800-564-8475. Be sure to use the promo code Jenna. This offer comes with a 10-year warranty and a 60-day money-back guarantee. It's time to start getting the quality sleep you deserve. This offer comes with a 10-year warranty and a 60-day money-back guarantee. It's time to start getting the quality sleep you deserve. Go to mypillow.com, use the promo code Jenna.